First and best reviewers, Archbishop Richard Whately, was correct when he observed that although she was evidently a Christian writer, her religion was not at all obtrusive. Her novels teem with clerics, but she largely avoids overt consideration of religious themes. Mansfield Park, however, is the closest that Austen came to writing a religious novel, and it has inspired a great deal of scholarly speculation about her religious allegiances. The concern with ordination, the consideration of the dangers of stage entertainments, and the consistent interest in effective sermon delivery have, for instance, led many scholars to see the work as the product of Anglican evangelicalism. While this is a rich area of investigation, I would like to suggest another context for this religious novel: Austen's interest in England's religious past, particularly the upheavals occasioned by the Reformation. I maintain that Austen is a savvy critic of the English Reformation, and that from her first writings to her last, she manifests an interest in the Reformation and the changes that it made to England's sacred landscape. In one of her first works, The History of England, written around 1791, she playfully attributes the dissolution of the monasteries to Henry VIII's fondness for picturesque scenery. In her last work, a poem on Winchester races written 3 days before her death, she allows St. Swithin, the town's patron saint whose famous shrine was dismantled in 1538, to curse the heedless racegoers who assume the past is buried and gone. Medieval abbeys, chapels, and churches abound in the novels that appeared in between these two texts: Northanger, Donwell Abbey in Emma, the Abbeyland in Sense and Sensibility, the Royal Garrison Chapel in Mansfield Park, which we'll be talking about today, and Battle Abbey in Sanditon. These buildings are more than just picturesque scenery. Their appearance offers Austen the opportunity to raise important questions about the transformation of formerly sacred properties and to criticize the cultural impoverishment that attended their loss. She addresses the legacy of the dissolution most clearly in Northanger Abbey, of course, but in this paper, I argue that the Reformation assault on religious houses equally haunts Mansfield Park, where ecclesiastical buildings inspire nostalgia for the monastic past. Fanny Price's musings on monastic architecture during the visit to Sotherton Chapel and her association with Portsmouth's Royal Garrison Chapel, a former hospice closed in 1540, provide Austen an opportunity to lament the decay of the physical and spiritual landscapes in the aftermath of the dissolution. So today, in this talk, I'd like to focus on those two episodes, on Sotherton, the visit to Sotherton, and on Portsmouth. Austen is not unique in deploring the hasty destruction of all religious houses by Henry VIII between 1536 and 1540. In this 4-year period, over 900 monasteries were closed as part of the king's break with Rome and reform of the church. The houses were plundered for their costly fittings and materials. Most were left in ruins, ultimately to become rock quarries for decades afterwards, but many were adapted into the stately homes of England's new elite, like Northanger Abbey. For 250 years, beginning soon after the last abbey closed and continuing through Austen's lifetime, a steady stream of historical and literary works celebrated the contributions of the monasteries to English life and decried their loss. Critics lamented the decay of monastic hospitality, as well as the destruction of funeral monuments and libraries that had preserved important information about England's past. Some considered the seizure of monastic property to be sacrilegious and argued that the kingdom was cursed as a result. Austen encountered these critiques through historical works, abbey meditation poems, travel writings, and accounts of picturesque scenery, as well as polemical works associated with contemporary debates about Catholic emancipation. She visited many important monastic sites in southern England. Some, like Stoneleigh in Warwickshire and Whitefriars in Canterbury, were owned by family members. Others, like Netley Abbey in Hampshire, were major tourist attractions. And she heard moving tales of the martyrdom and suffering of the house's former owners. Considering the impact of the dissolution on the English landscape, Christopher Woodward says there was not to be such a sudden change in the architectural landscape of Britain until the Second World War. It is not surprising that Austen might have had strong feelings about an event that eliminated centuries-old anchors of English culture, or that she might appropriate and extend the critiques of nostalgic commentators in her novels. So before we move into Mansfield Park, I wanted to give you a little bit of the flavor of some of this nostalgia that I'm talking about. And so I've isolated an anonymous poem called The Ruins of Walsingham, which is about Walsingham Priory, which was the second most popular and second largest pilgrimage site in medieval England after Canterbury. So it's located in Norfolk. It contained many important relics, including a famous image of the Virgin and Child and a replica of the Holy House of Nazareth. So this is what people came to see. Scores of famous people visited the shrine, including Erasmus and King Henry VIII, who, as tradition dictated, walked the last mile to the chapel, to the priory from the slippered chapel without shoes. And the priory inspired a host of literary and devotional works. Erasmus's visit, for instance, motivated him to write what became one of his most famous dialogues, A Pilgrimage for Religion's Sake, which satirized the practices of pilgrimage and veneration of relics. So here is the remnant of Walsingham Priory. There is this one majestic arch remaining of the church. And over to the right, there is a stately home that is built on part of the claustral buildings there to the side. But this is the picturesque scenery of Walsingham Priory. Now, I had the pleasure of going to visit Walsingham a few years ago when I was teaching a class on the English Reformation and took Vanderbilt students to England. And Walsingham is still a place of pilgrimage. So each year in May, Anglicans and Catholics come together for what they call the National Day of Pilgrimage. And there is a procession, religious procession, there is a mass said, a couple of thousand people show up. It was really wonderful because it was the closest approximation we could come to today for what it must have been like to be at a great pilgrimage site on an important festival day. So there were lots of people around. There was the procession there that we were able to see. And also each year there are some protesters who come to the pilgrimage site, and very low Protestant ones who want to protest against what they consider to be idolatrous behavior. And so here are some of those protesters that were there the day I visited. They're holding signs, in case you can't see it, that says, "Thus saith the Lord, repent and turn from your idols." Another says, "Masses are blasphemous fables and dangerous deceits." So it was kind of like the Reformation. It was an interesting Reformation moment that was happening here on our visit to Walsingham. So this is a very important and interesting place. And I've presented here the poem itself. I'm just going to kind of read through it, and you can follow along there if you want, because we'll be talking about this poem a little bit later today. In the racks of Walsingham, whom should I choose, the speaker says, but the Queen of Walsingham to be guide to my muse. Then thou, Prince of Walsingham, grant me to frame bitter plaints to rue thy wrong, bitter woe for thy name. Bitter was it, so to see the silly sheep murdered by the ravening wolves while the shepherds did sleep. Bitter was it, oh, to view the sacred vine while gardeners played all close, rooted up by the swine. Bitter, bitter, oh, to behold the grass to grow where the walls of Walsingham so stately did show. Such were the works of Walsingham while she did stand. Such are the racks as now do show of that holy land. Level, level with the ground the towers do lie, which with their golden glittering tops pierced once to the sky. Where were gates? No gates are now. The ways unknown where the press of peers did pass while her fame far was blown. Owls do shriek where the sweetest hymns lately were sung. Toads and serpents hold their dens where the palmers did throng. Weep, weep, O Walsingham, whose days are nights, blessings turn to blasphemies, holy deeds to despites. Sin is where Our Lady sat, heaven turned is to hell. Satan sits where our Lord did sway. Walsingham, oh, farewell. A moving poem, isn't it? The speaker is also a pilgrim here, but he's coming not to the pilgrimage site, but to the ruins of the former priory. Calling on the Virgin Mary, he walks through the former monastic church as he laments the change that the destruction made possible. The Reformation is imagined as the breaching of holy places by intruders, a sheepfold invaded by ravening wolves, which draws on a well-known biblical trope, and a garden left untended. And there may be a topical reference there to Bishop Stephen Gardiner, who was a conservative, but who did not oppose the dissolution of the monasteries. Using the before and after technique, which became conventional in this nostalgic literature, he draws a contrast between the priory's past and present. Grass grows where the stately walls of Walsingham so stately did show. The priory church towers, which once with their golden glittering tops pierced once to the sky, now lie level with the ground. Finally, the site is eerily empty and quiet. Owls do shriek where the sweetest hymns lately were sung, and toads and serpents are the only inhabitants. The speaker sees nothing good in a world which has so little regard for a place that had been sanctified by centuries of prayer and devotion. So this is just one example of many that I could have chosen here for you. There were many nostalgic works that were written starting at the end of the 16th century on. One is called The Fall of Religious Houses by Michael Sherbrooke, which laments the loss of these places. There's John Weaver's book called Ancient Funeral Monuments, which is about the preservation of inscriptions from churches that had been destroyed. Even Shakespeare in his 73rd sonnet refers to, kind of reflects longingly on the monasteries when he talks about the bare ruined choirs where late the sweet bird sang. Sounds very much like what's here in the poem about Walsingham. All right, so put that in one part of your minds and let's look to Southerton. Fanny Price articulates some of this lamentation on her visit to the empty chapel at Southerton Court. Although the Rushworths' house is Elizabethan and not, like Northanger, a former abbey, the appearance of its chapel sparks a conversation about the Reformation and the changes it fostered in both architecture and devotion. Fanny initially enjoys the tour of the house offered by Mrs. Rushworth, and she's the only member of the party who attended with unaffected earnestness to all that Mrs. Rushworth could relate of the family in former times. But she's disappointed when she visits the last space on the tour, the family chapel. Austen's narrator relates, Fanny's imagination had prepared her for something grander than a mere spacious oblong room fitted up for the purposes of devotion, with nothing more striking or more solemn than the profusion of mahogany and the crimson velvet cushions appearing over the ledge of the family gallery above. She communicates her disappointment to Edmund, telling him that this room is not my idea of a chapel, and she goes on to describe the elements that, in her opinion, comprise a suitable worship space. There's nothing awful here, nothing melancholy, nothing grand. Here are no aisles, no inscriptions, no banners. No banners, cousin, to be blown by the night wind of heaven. No signs that a Scottish monarch sleeps below. Fanny's ideal chapel is Gothic. The aisles and arches are traditional components of Gothic churches, and her preference for them declares her allegiance to past architectural styles and forms of devotion. Fanny prefers an evocative and atmospheric worship space, one that contains suitable liturgical furniture and pleases the eye. She imagines heraldic and military banners adorning the chapel, decorations that suggest a connection with great families whose piety motivated military achievements. Most important, Fanny believes that a chapel should be hallowed by the graves of the faithful. She values elaborate tombs, both memento mori structures and inscriptions of pious deeds, and believes that a chapel sanctity derives in part from the presence of ancestral bones. Although Mrs. Rushworth assures the guests that the chapel is now better decorated than it was in the past. It was fitted up as you see it, she says, in James II's time. The place lacks the sanctity and dignity Fanny expects from a place of worship. Edmund cut short Fanny's complaints by reminding her of the chapel's purpose. You forget, Fanny, how lately all this has been built, and for how confined a purpose, compared with the old chapels of castles and monasteries. It was only for the private use of the family. They have been buried, I suppose, in the parish church. There you must look for the banners and achievements. She immediately recognizes her mistake. It was foolish of me not to think of all of that, but is still disappointed and unsettled by a place almost entirely bereft of signs of Christian devotion. Fanny is wrong to expect a mere domestic chapel built after the Reformation to exhibit signs of medieval history and devotion, but her expectations are telling. She believes that any space consecrated to Christian worship should resemble a medieval church. Her architectural ideal is monastic, and she judges all worship spaces according to their conformity to it. In her opinion, even if Southerton's chapel is intended only for private use, its architecture and decoration should nevertheless suggest the dignity of the devotions practiced there. That Austen intends us to connect Fanny's disappointment with the chapel to Lamentations for England's monasteries is clear when we consider that two specific monasteries haunt the passage. The first is Stoneleigh Abbey, which was her Lee family's country seat, which scholars have often considered the inspiration for the chapel at Southerton Court. Fanny's objection to the place may owe something to Austen's awareness of alterations at Stoneleigh, where a neoclassical house replaced most of the medieval abbey. And of course, Austen's mother and the family visited there in 1805, and her mother is famous for talking about the profusion of rooms and how she could get lost in all the corridors as she moved around the house. So that's the first abbey. The second is Melrose Abbey in Scotland, the greatest of the Scottish border abbeys, which was founded in 630 AD and dissolved in 1560 when Scottish reformers seized power. Fanny's evocation of Scottish royal tombs and banners blown by the night wind of heaven is an allusion to Sir Walter Scott's description of Melrose in his narrative poem, The Lay of the Last Minstrel. In that work, Scott describes the abbey at its height in great detail as the characters search for a magical book hidden in one of its tombs. But he also reminds readers that the building is at present merely a ruin and encourages them to visit it and contemplate its remnants by moonlight, as so many 18th century visitors did. So here is the poem itself at the beginning of the second canto. Go visit it by the pale moonlight, for the gay beams of lightsome day gild but to flout the ruins gray. When the broken arches are black in night and each shafted oriel glimmers white, when the cold light's uncertain shower streams on the ruined central tower, when buttress and buttress alternately seem framed of ebon and ivory, when silver edges the imagery, then go, but go alone the while. Then view St. David's ruined pile, and home returning smoothly swear was never seen so sad and fair. By evoking here a famous literary visit to a former abbey, Austen marks the tour of Southerton Chapel as a prose adaptation of the Abbey Meditation poem, a popular 18th century literary genre. These poems follow a conventional format. An observer comes upon abbey ruins by twilight or moonlight, rhapsodizes over the picturesque or sublime qualities of the site, and engages in melancholy reflections upon the evanescence of human institutions and beliefs. Although Fanny sees Southerton in broad daylight, her lamentation over the abandonment of a formerly sacred space and her curiosity about the architecture and the people who once prayed there aligns the scene with this contemporary poetic form. While Fanny's attachment to monastic ruins is in one sense sentimental and romantic. I mean, after all, she has a transparency of Tintern Abbey in her Little East Room. It's also deeply nostalgic. In the 18th century, sentimentalized representations of medieval abbeys, like Scott's, often disguise serious critiques of their destruction or inspire unfavorable comparisons between the piety of the past and the present. Fanny's objection to the severity and plainness of a mere spacious oblong room fitted up for the purposes of devotion recalls the criticisms of 17th century writers who lamented the stripping of church interiors during the Reformation. Being a post-Reformation space, the Southerton Chapel was not literally stripped of its furnishings, but its simplicity and plainness are typical of post-Reformation ecclesiastical architecture and suggest the purity to which reformers wished to reduce the medieval buildings that they had inherited. Southerton's chapel is exactly the kind of uninspired and uninspiring room that Bishop John Howson, for instance, derided as an unworthy successor to the churches built in England during the Middle Ages. He complains that churches in his own time are little better than hogsties and regrets that they are not like the palaces of princes as they were in the primitive church, but more closely resemble a country hall, fair white-lined, or a citizen's parlor, at the best well wainscoted, as though we were rather Platonists than Christians. Howson is shocked that his contemporaries regard bare walls and a cover upon it to keep us from the rain as sufficient for a house of God. Decoration is not merely neglected. It is even unlawful, he writes, to add any ornament, except perchance a cushion and a wainscot seat for one's own ease and credit. Howson might be describing Southerton Chapel here, where the only notable features are extensive paneling and crimson velvet cushions. Otherwise, it is indistinguishable from any other room in the house. It is a site that neither Bishop Howson nor Fanny would find conducive to worship. Whereas monastic churches were designed to incorporate a variety of devotions and liturgical celebrations, post-Reformation churches were intended primarily for preaching. Howson regrets this development, saying that oratoria, or houses of prayer, are turned into auditoria, or places where you go to listen. The chapel at Southerton is also designed mostly for preaching. It possesses an altar, but the characters are careful to stay away from it. Fanny's disappointment with Southerton Chapel resembles the criticisms of Howson and a host of others who felt deeply the loss of sacred space in England during the dissolution. And it also prefigures, and I'll mention this at the end of the presentation, it also prefigures the Gothic revival and Augustus Pugin and others who felt like England needed to get back to its medieval architectural roots as a way to be reborn spiritually. So it's also prescient as well as looking back to the past. The space is not awful or melancholy or grand enough to arouse the spirit of devotion that Fanny believes monastic churches so easily elicited. But Fanny's disappointment with the look and feel of the chapel pale in comparison to her sadness that it is no longer in use. After praising the handsomeness of the chapel, Mrs. Rushworth tells the assembled guests that it was formerly in constant use both morning and evening. Prayers were always read in it by the domestic chaplain within the memory of many. But the late Mr. Rushworth left it off. The chapel is now merely an empty, dispensable room. In fact, Mrs. Rushworth's guests are the only people to have entered it recently. Once they leave, the narrator tells us, the chapel was left to the silence and stillness which reigned in it with few interruptions throughout the year. Fanny immediately laments this situation, believing that morning and evening prayer were a valuable part of former times, and a chapel and chaplain so much in character with the great house. Critics of the Reformation warned that questioning old beliefs and substantially altering or destroying churches, chapels, and monasteries would inevitably encourage skepticism and irreligion. Samuel Johnson, whose writings Austen loved and whose dislike of precipitate religious reform she likely shared, articulated this view when surveying the monastic ruins in Scotland. Of the destruction of churches, he says, the decay of religion must in time be the consequence. Johnson's prediction is borne out in the responses of Fanny's companions on the tour, who are unmoved by the chapel and dismissive of the religious devotions formerly practiced in it. After Mrs. Rushworth's relation of the leaving off of prayers in Mr. Rushworth's time, Mary Crawford immediately responds with a smile, every generation has its improvements. Unlike Fanny, Mary thinks only of the tedium of daily devotions. The obligation of attendance, the formality, the restraint, the length of time, altogether it is a formidable thing, and what nobody likes. And if the good people who used to kneel and gape, and notice those two terms which suggest superstition and credulity, kneeling, gaping, in that gallery could have foreseen that the time would ever come when men and women might lie another 10 minutes in bed when they woke with a headache, without danger of reprobation, because chapel was missed, they would have jumped with joy and envy. Maria Bertram shares Mary's dislike of spiritual discipline, which is apparent in her pleasure at the relative distance of the village church from Southerton House. I am glad the church is not so close to the great house as often happens in old places. The annoyance of the bells must be terrible. The benefits of regular devotion are lost on these women. They symbolize the attitudes of many in a society that had long ago laid violent hands upon its sacred places, leaving them stripped and cleansed of mystery and beauty. Numerous nostalgic writers in the 16th and 17th centuries commented regretfully on the cessation of ancient devotion and the silence of ruined churches that before the Reformation would have been thronged with pilgrims and worshipers. So I'd like for you to think back to the ruins of Walsingham for a minute. There are a lot of similarities. Having looked at Fanny's visit to Sotherton Chapel, we can see how much her encounter mirrors that of the earlier work. Fanny, like the speaker, tours a formerly hallowed place. Bitterness and sadness at the magnitude of the changes are the dominant emotions of the Walsingham poet. They are for Fanny as well. The Walsingham poet dwells on the contrast between past and present. Fanny emphasizes the greater religiosity of former times over against the spiritual lassitude of her own day. Grass grows where the walls of Walsingham did show. The church towers, which glittered and pierced once to the sky, now lie level with the ground. Most important, the shrine was filled with worshipers. It drew throngs of pilgrims who came to see the famous relics. Now, however, the site is eerily empty and quiet. Owls do shriek where the sweetest hymns lately were sung, and toads and serpents are the only inhabitants. While the Rushworths and their servants have not yet been replaced by owls, toads, and serpents, the silence and emptiness of the place are no less unsettling to Fanny. Fanny's nostalgic response even more directly evokes the rites of Durham, a loving, painstakingly detailed record of the monastic devotions formerly practiced at Durham Cathedral. And there is a shot of that magnificent place. Written around, and the main shrine here, of course, was for St. Cuthbert. Written around 1591, probably by a former monk of the chapter, the work takes the reader on a virtual tour of the pre-Reformation monuments, altars, and shrines that adorned the church interior before the dissolution. The rites surpasses other records, however, in including details of occulted liturgical celebrations, from the chanting of the daily office and Holy Week services to annual commemorations of the life of St. Cuthbert. Like the author of the rites, Austin asks us to imagine the prayers and devotions of previous generations, and the presence of the departed faithful can be felt here just as surely as it can in rites. Sotherton Chapel resembles Durham and thousands of other churches and abbeys in that it has been drained of its sacred character. The prayers of earlier inhabitants are now almost as alien to the Sotherton tour group as those the author of the rites describes, and Fanny responds to this sterile place of worship with the same melancholy as many viewers to ruined abbeys. Austin further emphasizes the sterility of Sotherton Chapel by making it the focus of a sham pilgrimage. With the exception of Fanny and Edmund, this is an entirely secular group. Unlike the medieval pilgrims who visited monastic shrines in the hope of accessing divine power centered in holy relics, the Sotherton party merely seeks diversion. The chapel is the climax of their tour, but they do not seek it out. They come upon it without purpose or design and depart unchanged. Even if they sought spiritual edification, they would be hard-pressed to find it in this particular chapel. It is bare and empty, affording neither the relics nor the saints' tombs that Fanny believes are proper stimulants to devotion. With no functioning chapel at its heart, Sotherton is a spiritual wasteland. After leaving it, the Crawfords and the Bertrams wander and lose themselves in the grounds. As these characters lose sight of where they are, we cannot help but recall Mr. Rushworth's disorientation on visiting the improved house of his friend, Mr. Smith. Once improved, an estate is cut off from its community and the social and spiritual values underlying it. Although not yet improved, Sotherton's empty chapel implies that there are no real barriers to transforming the estate from spiritual center to private playground. So I'd like to take a moment to comment on one other historical context that links this passage to a lost Catholic past. So Mrs. Rushworth, you will remember, says that the chapel was fitted up as you see it in James II's time. So when I was writing the book and dealing with this passage, I missed what I think is something very significant about it. I didn't fully appreciate this detail and really kind of assumed that it was a gloss on the chapel's plainness. So the only attempts at beautifying the place consisted of a few crimson cushions that were added well over 100 years before. But Austin, I think now, is doing much more with this historical reference. James II, who ruled from 1685 to 88, when he was replaced by William and Mary in the Glorious Revolution, was of course a Catholic monarch bent on reestablishing England as a Catholic realm. His 3-year reign was a time of Catholic consolidation, when Roman clergy appeared openly on the streets of London and at court. It was a time when the chapels of recusant families underwent elaborate refurbishment in the new climate of toleration for the old faith. 17th century diarists like John Evelyn and Samuel Pepys, for example, document the transformation of the chapels royal at Whitehall and St. James's Palace into Catholic worship spaces and record their amazement at observing the celebration of Mass firsthand at the very heart of English royal power. Most important for my own particular interpretation of this passage, however, is that the reigns of James and his father, Charles II, witnessed the establishment of the first monastery in England since the dissolution. And his brother, Charles II. This religious house was attached to the Palace of St. James and was built for Charles's wife, Catherine of Braganza, to house the Portuguese clergy she brought with her. The monastic building stood behind the Queen's Chapel, and there it is today, there at the St. James's Palace complex. And the monastic buildings would have been built to the rear of this and around where now Marlborough House stands. And you can visit the Queen's Chapel at certain times of the year still. The Chapel Royal meets part of the time in the official chapel in St. James Palace, part of the year, and part of the year here in the Queen's Chapel. So it's a lovely place to visit. Pepys visited this monastery and was pleased with what he saw. He speaks approvingly of the very pretty library of the monks and says that their cells had views of a fine garden and the park. The monastery was abandoned when Queen Catherine moved her household to Somerset House, but it was reopened in James II's reign. Brian Southam is probably right in asserting that the Rushworth family were recusants, but the association of the chapel with the time of James II more generally links it to an era of Baroque ecclesiastical splendor, to a period when it seemed briefly that monasteries would again dot the English landscape. Fanny Price's preference for monastic architecture then assumes even greater significance in relation to a chapel that is marked by the Catholic Stuart past. Fanny's preferences may be Austen's. We should not forget Austen's deep sympathy for the Stuart family, manifest in her History of England and marginal comments in her copy of Goldsmith's History of England. Mary Spongeburg points out that Austen consistently shows sympathy for all who, like the Stuarts, were denied their position or property. Fanny's romantic longings for the past recall 2 famous instances of purloined property: a king deprived of his kingdom, and monks and nuns ejected from their cloisters. But Austen does more than merely allow Fanny to muse on the changes in architecture and devotion in post-dissolution England. She enhances Fanny's status as a nostalgic commentator by associating her with an actual medieval hospice closed in 1540 as part of the dissolution. Fanny and her family worship at Portsmouth's Royal Garrison Chapel, which had a long, illustrious medieval history. The chapel appears in the context of Mr. Crawford's Sunday visit with the family. The Prices were just setting off for church the next day when Mr. Crawford appeared again. He came not to stop, but to join them. He was asked to go with them to the Garrison Chapel, which was exactly what he had intended, and they all walked thither together. And there is the chapel today, and it is partially in ruin, but that is not because of the effect of religious violence in the 16th century. It was bombed during the Second World War. And so the nave of the church was left open, kind of as a monument and reminder. And then the choir of the church was refitted as a small chapel. So there it is, looking from the west door towards where the chapel is today. So it's still a very affecting monument there. In Portsmouth. The chapel is the Price's regular place of worship, located next to the naval ramparts on which Mrs. Price liked to promenade every fine Sunday throughout the year. Directly after morning service, the church naturally served as the Price's parish. Founded in 1212 as a Domus Dei, or God's house, offering hospitality to the local poor and ill, as well as pilgrims coming to England to visit shrines at Winchester and Canterbury, the hospital was a center of devotion and care in Portsmouth until the dissolution. It endured the usual treatment given to former religious establishments: Costly liturgical furnishings were stripped and sold. The brothers and sisters were pensioned, and the buildings were devoted to secular use. In this case, the structures were initially used as a munitions warehouse. The proximity of the Domus Dei to the naval ramparts meant that it profited from royal attention to the fortifications during Elizabeth I's reign, however, and was saved from falling into ruin. Dissolved monasteries largely suffered one of three fates: destruction, transformation into the houses of the elite, or in rare instances, adaptation for parish or diocesan worship. The garrison chapel experienced the latter two. The dormitory became a church, and the master's house and hall became government house, the residence of the governor of the garrison. Although alterations to the buildings were made over the subsequent 200 years, they continued to serve the same purpose through Austen's lifetime. A visitor to Portsmouth while her brothers were in school there, Austen knew the church well and would have been familiar with its pre-Reformation history. I should also add that the Garrison Chapel, like Southerton Chapel, has Stuart historical associations. So Catherine of Braganza, for whom that monastery was built at St. James, married Charles II in 1661 in a Catholic ceremony in the governor's residence. Here again, I think Austen's yoking two very famous examples of dispossession, 16th century monks and her favorite royal exile family. While the reference to the chapel is brief, the only detail given about its interior is that officers and sailors sit separately from civilians. Its appearance in the story is not gratuitous. Austen specifically characterizes Fanny's visit to Portsmouth with the restoration of her health, the goal of so many who came to the Domus Dei over the centuries. The narrator tells us that the sending of Fanny to Portsmouth had very little to do with the propriety of seeing her parents again, and nothing at all to do with the idea of making her happy. For Sir Thomas, instead, it was a medicinal project upon his niece's understanding, which he must consider as at present diseased. Austen's use of the words medicinal and diseased subtly invokes the ancient curative duties of the town's most significant medieval institution, now transformed into the Price family's parish church. Her visit to Portsmouth does cure her by causing her to appreciate Mansfield in contrast to the squalor of the Price home, but it of course does not achieve Sir Thomas's goal of reconciling her to a marriage with Henry Crawford. The very fact that Sir Thomas considers Fanny diseased and in need of treatment demonstrates how little he understands her and how far he is from the medieval brothers and sisters who attempted to alleviate rather than cause the real suffering of others. Beyond the medicinal associations conjured by the Garrison Chapel, the building is a tangible reminder of the tradition of hospitality that was lost when the monasteries were closed, and Austen uses it to critique the lack of hospitality in the world of Mansfield Park. Lamentations for monastic hospitality were among the chief features of nostalgic writing. Critics railed against the appropriation by the rich of lands and institutions given to the church over hundreds of years to support the poor. Early reformers like Bishop Hugh Latimer and Henry Brinklow, certainly no friends to monasticism, nevertheless concluded it would have been better to allow the monasteries to continue rather than see the portion of the poor consumed by the rich. This theme endured and was even taken up by William Cobbett in Austen's time. Brinklow, a London evangelical who died in the mid-1540s, wrote a number of works in which he criticized the lost opportunities for good that might have resulted from the dissolution of the abbeys. He was particularly incensed at how much the poor suffered from the loss of these homes. Whereas before the dissolution, the poor, impotent creatures received some of the scraps of monastic wealth. Now they have nothing. Before, they had hospitals and almshouses, but now they lie and starve in the streets. In the past, was their number great, but now much greater. He concludes it would have been better had the abbeys remained in the hands of the monks and nuns, rather than become sources of private wealth. Hospitality, or the lack thereof, is a major theme of Mansfield Park. The novel begins with a discussion of hospitality when Aunt Norris and the Bertrams decide to take in their poor niece from Portsmouth. However, the inhabitants of Mansfield are not true purveyors of hospitality. The Bertrams assign Fanny to a cold, remote room filled with cast-off furniture. The Bertram sisters never offer Fanny the use of their own horses. Aunt Nora ceaselessly reminds Fanny how little she deserves the care she receives, surely an attitude that is the antithesis of hospitality. By associating Fanny with a medieval building where hospitality formerly was dispensed, Austen deepens the critique of the Bertrams' reception of their niece. Had Fanny appeared at the gatehouse of the Domus Dei, she would have been welcome regardless of her social graces or status. She would have been fed and housed by those whose religious vocation demanded they work to alleviate suffering. The Bertrams, by contrast, feel no religious duty toward Fanny and continually emphasize that she does not belong. In his History of the Protestant Reformation, William Cobbett rehearses earlier nostalgic tropes by challenging his readers to compare the hospitality of the monks with the reception they might receive at the whitewashed and dry-rotten gentleman's house that arose on the site of a former abbey. By alluding to the garrison chapel in a novel that so clearly indicts the lack of hospitality among an English gentry family, Austen offers the same challenge. Rather than engage in open polemics like Cobbett or his ancestors in the nostalgic tradition, however, Austen prefers to make her point about England after the dissolution by dramatizing the story of a vulnerable young girl denied true care and concern. By doing so, she seems to confirm early fears that the eradication of monasteries and hospitals left the poor without proper care or advocacy. So, why does knowing about Austen's attitude to the Reformation matter? How does it make us better readers of Austen's novels? I think there are many answers to those questions, but I'll isolate two here today. First, I think that acknowledging Austen's place in a long tradition of nostalgia and lamentation for the religious institutions of England's past deepens the conclusions of a host of scholars, particularly Marilyn Butler and Alistair Duckworth, who regard Austen as a conservative in the mode of Edmund Burke, someone who disliked precipitate change. For Burke, improvers and projectors are too hasty in destroying traditions and institutions, and the result is chaos. He demonstrates this amply in his reflections on the revolution in France. For the revolutionaries, Burke says, it is a sufficient motive to destroy an old scheme of things because it is an old one. A spirit of innovation is generally the result of a selfish temper and confined views, he writes, and he asserts that no good can come from men who never look backward to their ancestors. With the closing and plunder of French monasteries in mind, Burke warns that it is of infinite caution that any man ought to venture upon pulling down an edifice which has answered in any tolerable degree for ages the common purposes of society. Burke could just as easily be speaking here of 16th century England as he is of 18th century France. I can think of no greater improver or projector than King Henry VIII, and Austen's subtle critique of the monumental changes to the English landscape fostered by him in Mansfield Park and in Northanger Abbey especially confirms her conservative orientation. So that's the first one. Second, I think, recognizing Austen's sympathy for the medieval past helps us see her deep sensitivity to the intellectual and spiritual currents of her own day. Austen's commentary on the religious past appears only a few years before the Gothic revival and the Oxford movement were to transform England by appealing to the goodness of medieval architectural and theological ideals. Augustus Pugin, designer of the Houses of Parliament, decried the post-Reformation preference for building churches in the classical style, seeing it as what he called melancholy evidence of the decay of faith and morals. Like Fanny Price, Pugin regards Gothic architecture as the most appropriate for Christian worship, the style most conducive to fill the mind with veneration. Austen's novels appear just as England was about to embark on a vast reckoning with its pre-Reformation past, and her willingness to consider this past favorably served as a harbinger of what was to come. Thank you very much. So I will stop sharing my screen there and move on.
Thank you very much, Professor Moore. That was great. Really,
You're very welcome.
really enjoyed that. So we'll let everybody type some questions into the chat and see if you have any questions for Professor Moore. And if you want to know anything about the Reformation or anything along those lines.
Yes, I'm happy to answer questions.
So I'll start out, and Professor Moore, the church I grew up in was a, Gothic, neo-Gothic cathedral, made to look like the old ones. And I have to say that whenever I go into a modern one, I kind of feel the same way. Like what happened to all the stuff?
Right. I think that's right.
Yeah, and I know that that a lot of people kind of feel that way about more modern churches. They just sometimes just can't get used to it.
That's right. That's right. And I think that's what's so interesting about Fanny. I mean, she's responding to the classical architecture of the 18th century, the churches that were built then. And you have to remember that after the Reformation, there was not much church building in England for the next 100 years. It's really in the reign of James and Queen Anne and into the 18th century that you start having lots of new churches built, and they're built largely in a classical style. And that was very popular. You think about, I talk in the book about the Domus Dei being the opposite of St. George's Hanover Square, which is a beautiful classical church and kind of emblematizes this. And I think this is what's happening with the Gothic revival in the 19th century is the recognition, what you, Lisa, have said, what Fanny has said about the atmospheric qualities of the religious space and how important those are.
Okay, so the questions are coming in, so I'm going to do the first one. Okay. This is from Thomas. He says, are you suggesting that Austen was hankering after medieval Catholicism, or that she was very high church?
Well, that's a great question. I don't think that she was a crypto-Catholic. I don't think that she was highly hankering in a way for the Catholic past, but I don't think that she had to be in order to lament what had happened in England during the Reformation. So I think she did have some more sympathies, I think, with what today we might consider a kind of high church idea. But I think that she would see what had happened in the past. She could see that as lamentable without having to necessarily long for the restoration of Catholicism. Now, the one thing that does kind of complicate this, of course, is her known predilection for the Stuart family and for Mary, Queen of Scots, the great Catholic martyr. So there's a way you could say that all of this kind of tends towards a kind of hankering after Catholicism. There's an interesting way in which it was possible in the 1790s for English Protestants like Austen to be sympathetic with the Catholic Church without seeming to be too far outside the mainstream, because of the sympathy they felt for the persecution of Christians in France during the Revolution. So there was certainly a way in which the persecuted Catholics there were regarded as closer in some way to Anglicans in England, and there was a good deal of sympathy, I think, there. So that's a rambling answer to your question. I hope that does so in part.
So Deborah just has a rhetorical question, so no answer needed, but I thought it was funny, so I'll mention it. She says, oddly enough, I spotted a monk on the street today. He was riding an electric skateboard. What would Fanny think? All right, so on to a non-rhetorical question. When churches, abbeys, this is from Jameson. When churches, abbeys were being torn down, did the landowners get first dibs to convert them into homes?
So there were, all of the property was brought into the government's treasury. There was an institution, an office that was established called the Court of Augmentations. kind of a interesting government speak, the augmentation of their treasury. And so all that property had to come in through there. And it was royal property. But we have lots of records of particular landowners asking for certain monastic properties or places, particularly if their families had been closely associated with that particular church or abbey. So if they had given money in the past, or if their ancestors had had some sort of connection to it. So there are extant a number of begging letters from landowners asking for these properties. So they didn't necessarily have first dibs, but they certainly wanted to take advantage of the sale and lease of these properties.
Okay, then Marcia asks a question similar to the previous one. Austin defends and even praises the devotion of Catholics in the history of England. Do you think she was serious?
I think that the history of England is masks a much more serious purpose than we might think. I mean, it's hilarious. It's just like if any of you have read the book 1066 and all that, which totally massacres English history and gets everything wrong. And they refer to Bloody Mary as Broody Mary, all sorts of kind of, and that's kind of what she's doing in the history of England. So she's lampooning the historians like Goldsmith, but I think there's also something very serious. I think that her devotion to Mary, Queen of Scots was serious. I think in other places in her writings, she makes formal statements that are not comic about her sympathy for Mary, Queen of Scots, for the Stuart family overall, for James II in one instance. So I think that she was serious. I think if we look at that carefully, that tells us something about her overall kind of nostalgia for England and sympathy with those who have been cast aside by history, whether it's Stuart family, which got moved right out and ended rather ignominiously those last few Stuarts in France in the 18th century, or whether it's monks and nuns who got kicked out of their property. So I think she is serious.
Thank you. So Thomas returns with another question about this same topic. He says that perhaps her predilection for Stuarts and Mary, Queen of Scots was more a form of romanticism than an agreement with their principles.
Excellent point. That's right. So Mary, Queen of Scots was hugely popular at the end of the 18th century and in the 19th century. I mean, it really was a kind of deep romantic response. And you find it in works like The Children of the Abbey by Regina Maria Roach, which kind of spins a whole alternate history of Mary, Queen of Scots, two twin children, and presents the whole period sympathetically. You find it in Schiller's play. I mean, there's just a lot of this romantic interest in Mary Stuart. And so I think some of what Austin is showing us is related to that. But I think that her family also had documented over time sympathy with the Stuarts. And so I think it's also something more serious for her too. It just happens to coincide with the period when other people were finding Mary, Queen of Scots interesting intellectually and spiritually.
Okay, thank you. So now we have a comment and a suggestion from Marie, who is from Chattanooga, which I cannot say in the Tennessee way. I have to say it in upstate New York way. So her comments are echoing Lisa's remarks about her own home church. I'm recalling that my own home church, St. Paul's Episcopal Chattanooga, was built in 1888 by an architect who was a native of the Isle of Man and used an old abbey on the Isle as a model for the new St. Paul's. An interesting reflection of interest in an old abbey in the New World. And then she suggests, as senior warden of Christ Church Cathedral, Nashville, for you to take a spin down 124 I-24 sometime and check it out.
Well, I certainly will. And who is that made that?
Marie Sprayberry.
Yes.
Well, Marie, I certainly will. And Marie, I'm actually speaking to you today from Swanee, Tennessee. So
Are you? Okay.
yeah, so at the end of last year, we ended up buying a place up here in Swanee. And because we're working from home, I've been spending a lot more time here than in Nashville. But I've never visited St. Paul's in Chattanooga. So I definitely need to come down and have a look. My goodness.
Since my time, some of the renovations and additions have done even more for the, monastic feel of the place, I suppose. There's now a cloister garden. I understand there's a maze.
Wow. Well, I definitely need to go. Thank you.
When I was growing up, my godmother was the parish secretary, so I sort of had free run of the place while I was waiting for choir rehearsals to get started.
So you got to look at all the nooks and crannies, right?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you for a very good talk.
You're welcome.
When the pandemic ends someday soon, pop over to Chattanooga and check it out.
I will.
All right, so let's see. We have another question from Thomas. Wasn't part of the purpose of the closing of the abbeys to have wealth to distribute to important figures to ensure their loyalty to the crown?
Yes, so that's exactly right. This was both a means for Henry VIII to fill his own coffers again, because he was an extravagant man who was a great builder, and he owned and built 40 homes or something. And so he needed the money, but it was also a way to consolidate his following, because Henry VIII, this is why he was so determined to have a son, was because he still felt that the Tudor dynasty was tenuous on the throne. I mean, it had to be reestablished. And so he wanted to get as much legitimacy as possible, and he wanted to provide people with reason for being loyal. And so he rewarded people with grants of land or leases of land and that had come from the abbeys. And the amount of land that they owned was immense. So a large proportion, and I'm not certain exactly of the exact percentage of the property in England, was owned by abbeys and villages. They were the chief employer of many of people in England. So it was a very rich prize. And this was a good way to do that. And he established a number of today's still great ducal and aristocratic families really got their start at the time of the Reformation. So I'm thinking about the Dukes of Bedford, which I talked about in my AGM talk, made their fortune as a result of this, and today are still one of the wealthiest families in England. So it was, long story short, yes, it was a way to do that. And Henry liked to take people from lower levels of society and bring them up. I mean, he was surrounded by Cardinal Wolsey, who was not an aristocrat, Thomas Cromwell, certainly not either. And these people would owe him ultimate allegiance for the kind of elevation he gave them through wealth and property.
Thank you. Here's one from Donna. Do you think Jane Austen had a change of heart regarding higher worship when she told her niece Fanny, "I'm not sure we shouldn't all be evangelicals"?
That's a great spot, and that's one of the statements that has gotten so much interest in talking about Mansfield Park and Anglican evangelicalism, because in one place she says, "Oh, I don't like the Anglican evangelicals at all," and she refers to a pastor that she knew very well and speaks kind of disparagingly of that. But then she also has this statement that suggests sympathy. So I think that she probably saw, that was a statement that showed she probably regarded the greater kind of moral rectitude that was required by the more severe Anglican evangelical groups to have a kind of power to it. And I can certainly see how we can interpret Fanny Price as one of those, as someone who has this kind of personal, deep commitment to religion that is reflective of some of these greater rigoristic movements in the English church during the time. So I think she probably could see some sympathy, but I think that, like most people in England in the 18th century, Austin was wary of enthusiasm. And by enthusiasm, I mean any kind of religious feeling that led one into an overwrought kind of fervor. And certainly these dissenting groups and lower church groups within the Church of England kind of smacked of that. And ever since the 17th century, people were not very happy with religious people who got too focused on their religion.
Yeah, and they don't need another Puritan group coming in.
No.
All right, so Ariel asks, I would like to ask about the divergent purposes of these abbeys in literature. For example, Lord Byron outfits his inherited home, Newstead Abbey, into a Gothic playground where he would host parties with pastimes like drinking out of drug-up monk skulls, or Wadsworth's lines from Tintern Abbey in which he, Wordsworth, not Wadsworth, sorry, lines from Tintern Abbey in which he reflects on the changing scenery. Why are these ruins deemed elements of the picturesque, like the hermit grottos or the rusticated woodlands? Do you think they are still serving their purpose as memento mori, since they show the deterioration of civilization?
Yes, so those are great observations and questions. I do think they still serve for those writing about abbeys in the 18th and 19th centuries. They do kind of still serve as memento mori, as reminders of, as I said earlier, the evanescence of human institutions and human lives. And so that's kind of where some of the sympathy comes. They can see, even though these people were in a faith that was superstitious and antithetical to their own, nevertheless, there's something sympathetic about the loss that they experienced. So I do think that, and I think that the picturesque, this is one of the reasons why we have this explosion of literature about ruined abbeys, starting in the 1740s and 50s and moving on up, whereas we didn't before. So if you look in, it's due to the picturesque. So there's not a lot of commentary in the 17th century about specific commentary about abbeys and ruins. They don't show up in quite the same way that they start doing in the middle of the 18th century. And that's largely due to the fondness for and the articulation of these new theories of the picturesque. So the picturesque requires a broken environment, not something that's beautiful, which is smooth and pleasant, but something that is jagged and it contains remnants of things. And certainly these abbeys afforded that kind of brokenness that was valued aesthetically. And so I think that is why they become so important and why we start developing that series of abbey meditation poems. And Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey is kind of at the end of this tradition. So he doesn't even really mention the abbey in the poem. He doesn't really describe it or anything, but it's there, it's hovering over that, that poem certainly. But he's the heir to these earlier poems that were about people going and visiting the places and looking at the ruins themselves. So he's part of this tradition as well. And for Byron, there's that sense of self-parody that he was always involved in, kind of like Horace Walpole, who at Strawberry Hill tried to create a house that had a medieval past and referred to it himself as the Abbot of Strawberry. Even though that house had no monastic history at all. And he's doing something similar to, I think, Byron, who kind of revels in the Gothic, and by that I mean Gothic novelistic kind of associations of abbeys.
Thank you. Here's another one. Brenda asks, Dr. Moore, as you mentioned, some interpreters consider Mansfield Park to have a lot of evangelical themes. Others think Austin is very much promoting a more orthodox Anglicanism here. What is your opinion on this question?
Yes, that's a great question. I think that she's commenting, it's the latter. She's commenting more generally on kind of Anglicanism and Anglican religion rather than the evangelicalism, kind of for the reasons I said earlier. You know, Austin was not someone who was sympathetic to boisterous and rigoristic expressions of religion. And so I just don't see her, because of that, I just don't see her as proffering some message about Anglican evangelicalism in Mansfield Park. But that doesn't mean that she's not drawing on tropes and ideas and things that were in the air about religious reform that make their way into Fanny and that make their way into discussion of sermon delivery. I mean, how many novels do you know where there's this much talk about how to give a good sermon? How many do you know that talk about the evils of stage entertainments? So those were themes that were important to low church evangelicals in the Anglican church. So I think she's aware of those trends. She sees something of value in them, but she's not doctrinaire.
Thank you. So here's, I think, is going to be our last question for today. And it's from Marcia. She wants to know, what is the portrait on the wall behind Professor Moore?
No. So let's see if I can give you a better sense of it. So there it is. That is Elizabeth, the wife of the second Earl of Bristol. And she died about 1740 after bearing 17 children.
Yikes.
So this was made earlier on in life. She's more youthful and less bedraggled, as you might imagine, after that. But she was a great hostess. And I believe that Voltaire, when he was visiting England, dined at her table. So that's who that is. It's a lovely portrait, and I get a lot of pleasure from looking at that. So I thought, when I'm giving talks on Jane Austen, I was looking for an appropriate place. And I thought about, well, Vanderbilt has a studio that we've developed since the pandemic, where you can do Zoom presentations and have a kind of all the technology set up, and it has a podium and all. And I thought, oh, well, maybe I should try doing some of these from that. And then I thought, well, maybe I should just do it from some sort of Austen related, or what looks like a kind of 18th century environment. So I chose this. So that's who that is.
Thank you. Well, I think everybody really enjoyed your talk. It's fascinating, very interesting to kind of examine some of the things behind what goes on in Mansfield Park, or in any Jane Austen novel, but in this case, Mansfield Park. We have a lot of compliments in the chat about how everybody has loved your talk so much. If everybody wants to just unmute themselves so they can give a big round of applause for Professor Moore, that would be great.
Hey, applause, 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 applause.
Yay! Huzzah!
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it. This has been a great discussion. So I really had a good time. And again, I'm very glad that you asked me to speak.
Thank you very much for coming. We hope to see some of you at our next talk and at our talks in the future. So have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Lisa.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Lisa,
Yes.
I just wanted to thank you for my postcard.
Oh, you're welcome.
I thought, oh, isn't this nice? I didn't know how to respond or so I thought, well, I'll just do it now. But I have it here where I read my Jane Austen collection and use it as a bookmark.
Oh, great. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Glad you liked it. And I just wanted to, touch base with folks. And I hope I